one of the first differences with med school financial aid offices is that we're really small. So you go to undergrad, if you get financial aid, usually those offices consist of 10, 20, 30 people that are processing aid, depending on the size of the school and the student enrollment. Usually students have a counselor that they're assigned to based on like the first letter of their last name or whatever the school decides. When it gets to medical school, there are a lot of med schools that have a financial aid office of one. So ours is pretty average in size. There are 4 of us, but we also process aid not just for medical students. So we process aid for all of the students at the medical school. So our physical therapy students, occupational therapy students, various other scientific degrees like masters in clinical investigation, et cetera. So still, in having a small office, we try to get to know the students really well, and that is across the board. When I go to conferences, talk to other med school financial aid directors and officers, they really do try to get to know the students, even though it is a smaller office, because the amount of debt that medical students take on and the complexity of that debt, plus when they get out of medical school, they have the highest debt in their career and the lowest salary when they go through residency. And then when residency's over, there's this huge, shift, really, in their salary. So they really do try to get to know students one-on-one and find out about their family situation and their financial situation and try to give them a lot of education as far as debt education, debt management, and how to take care of those loans as they continue through life. So this is kind of the long list, things to compare across schools. So the AAMC, their website is terrific for students. They actually have, it's called First for Medical Students, and they actually have their website broken up into sections. So students who are applying for medical school, so what do you have to do? You have to take the MCAT, how to apply for aid, some things to compare. They have all the information about comparing different schools on the academic side, the financial side. Then they have a whole section for when students are in medical school, so how can they reduce debt, live like a student, talks about credit, all of these things. And then they have a whole nother section for residency. So it's a really good, not to promote the AAMC, because once students fill out that MCAT form, they are really tied to them, but they do have, med students are their target audience, so they do have a lot of really good resources on their website to start comparing schools and things like that. So tuition is kind of one of the biggest things, just like when you were looking at undergrad institutions, how much is it gonna cost you or your student? So tuition is huge. Med school is expensive, even more so than undergrad, especially if you're at a private medical school. So looking at all those comparisons, merit-based aid, not all medical schools have merit-based aid. Not all of them have need-based scholarship dollars. So those are things to compare. Parental information, which I'll talk about. You aren't off the hook for medical school, potentially. It really depends on where your child ends up going. Most of the private medical schools still require parental information because they use it to help determine institutional aid, which I'll go into. A lot of the schools that are focused on graduating primary care physicians, because there's primary care funding from the government that requires parental information. Those schools will require parental information if they have that funding. If a school really is only looking at providing their students with federal funds, then the government no longer cares about your information as a parent, because the government just looks at enrollment, citizenship, and the cost, and then there are funds available for the student based on the student's information. So then the parent side really comes from what the school has to offer and the requirements there. And then we'll talk about packaging formulas, debt, and some other things outside of that. So talking about cost, this is our current first-year cost of attendance. So every school creates a cost of attendance or budget for their students in whatever class or program they're in. So our tuition, which is pretty normal, largest component of a cost of education. Tuition for our current first-year students is $63,230. Books and supplies, that's their stethoscope, sphygmometer, pen lights, otoscope, a couple of other things, and a couple of books cost them about $1,400 in the first year. It's much less after that because they're purchasing all of those medical instruments that they're going to need throughout medical school in their career. And those costs are, the medical instrument cost is pretty common, pretty standard across the board. Some schools will have like a stethoscope program, and they'll give a stethoscope to incoming students. So again, that would be a cost savings. Not all schools do that. But because basically it's the same vendor selling that to all of the medical students, they all go across the country, go to schools. The students are basically spending the same amount of money no matter where they are for that. And then all other expenses are living expenses. So when you're comparing the cost, it's not just tuition. I mean, the living expenses make a difference too. A student going to school in Boston or San Francisco or New York, those are some of the most expensive cities in the country. So it's going to cost them more with the living expenses than it will for St. Louis, which is one of the cheaper cities with medical schools in the country, because it is really inexpensive to live here. So the most that a medical student could have in financial aid as a first-year med student this year at the medical school is $82,758. And I would say for cost of attendance ranges, when I look at that, the lower costs are still somewhere in the $60,000 range up to $100,000+ range. It really depends on the school's curriculum, their tuition cost, and then their living expenses for that year. Our tuition, we have a program that fixes tuition for entering students. So what happens is for us, the board of trustees, the chancellor, the dean of the medical school, they all get together in the spring and determine what tuition is going to be for that year's upcoming class. And then that rate is fixed for that entering class for 5 years. So med school is only 4, but it is more and more common for students to take a year out of medical school and get another degree, take a year off and do research within the 4 years. So we fix it for a 5-year period so that if a student decides to do that when they come back into the MD curriculum, their tuition is the same as it was when they left. If a student decides to go get a law degree and they're out of the curriculum for 3 years, something like that, then their tuition would increase to the class that they join. Most schools have the kind of US standard where tuition increases every year that are in school. So that's another thing when you're comparing costs, looking at our tuition might be higher for the entering year, but by the time you get 4 years down the road, if there's a 4% or whatever their average increase is every year, they might come out much higher than us at the end of the 4 years. We also have a comprehensive tuition charge, which means that we don't have any additional fees. So those things that you're used to paying, student activities fees, computer lab fees, library access fees, whatever it might be, we don't have any of that. It's all just part of tuition. So students at our school pay one lump sum. That's not the norm. Most schools will have tuition and then fees. So when you're looking at US News and World Report or any of the other kind of statistical data that gets published about schools and costs out there, Princeton Review, things like that, you can't just look at a tuition line item when you're comparing the cost of schools. You really have to look at tuition and then any required fees that those schools are charging. Because for us, if students are only looking at tuition, we're here, schools are here, but when you add in all those required fees, a lot of times they come out much higher than ours. So that's just telling you everything's online. It's all on our website. So you can go there anytime. If you ever want this presentation, you can email me and I'll send it to you. So various types of financial aid. So this is what we have: merit scholarships, need-based financial aid, access to federal loans, non-need-based aid, and outside funding opportunities. Now the majority of this is going to apply to students who are US citizens or permanent residents of the US, because for need-based financial aid, federal loans, you have to be a US citizen or permanent resident. Some schools will provide merit scholarships for international students. Some schools will look at international students for need-based financial aid. It's very spotty. Everyone's different when it comes to international students and what they require. Very different from undergrad for an international student. So we have a lot of merit scholarships. We have one of the oldest, largest MSTP, medical scientist training programs in the country, and we also have one of the oldest merit scholarship programs for medical schools in the country. A lot of schools that didn't have merit scholarships are starting to come out with merit money, so it's getting a little different in the last probably 5 years. But before that, we were one of the few that had as many merit scholarships as we do. So this is just to give you an idea of how many students in a given year could have a portion of their tuition paid. So we have an entering class size of 120 to 125 students. Class sizes range. The smallest one that I am aware of for med school is about, for like a top medical school, is about 80 to 85 students. And the largest, some of the state schools are closer to 200 students. So that class size ranges. The more students that they have coming into the university, potentially, the more they have to stretch their dollars. So class size can potentially play a role in how much aid students are getting. So medical scientist training program, out of a entering class size of 120 to 25 students, we have 25 that are going to be fully funded potentially through our MD, PhD, MSTP training program. So students that are getting merit scholarships, need-based financial aid, loans, et cetera, we have about 95 to 100 students each year that are coming through for that. Typically, we have the equivalent of 18 full tuition scholarships to award then to that population of students. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but on average, it's about 18. We have some scholarships that come up every 4 years or 3 years, so they're kind of cyclical. And when those come together, sometimes we have up to 22 full tuition scholarships to award. Some of them have to be awarded as full tuition scholarships. So out of those 18, usually at least 8 to 10, so about half will be awarded as full tuition scholarships because that's what the donor has told us they wanted to do or the requirements of the scholarship. The other half can be split up, and every year for us it's different. It depends on our applicant pool and the exact dollars that we have. So for instance, this year we had about 10 full tuition scholarships awarded to incoming students. I think there were about 8 half tuition scholarships awarded to incoming students. And then there were another, I can't remember exactly, maybe 10 students where they really split that money up and students received anywhere from $10,000 to $60,000 as a merit scholarship. For us, merit is awarded to incoming students and then it's good for 4 years. Other schools, if they have merit, they might wait, see what your first year grades are, what they come back is, see how well you've performed, and then they award merit scholarships. Some will do it after the first 2 years, or they'll review every year after they start getting it to you. We do review it. We do make sure that the student who receives those merit scholarships, because it's merit, is still doing well academically. But in almost 20 years, I've never seen a scholarship taken away from a student. So typically our students that receive those scholarships continue to perform very well academically at our school. Olin Fellowship for Women is another thing that we have. I think it is specific to Washington University. It is not specific to the medical school though, so there's women in various different graduate programs at Washington University that will end up receiving Olin Fellowships each fall. And we usually have about 4 full tuition Olin Fellowships to award to women in each entering class. Other thing about merit, some schools will require a separate application. So if they have merit scholarship dollars, you apply to medical school, you get through that application, you find out about your admission, and then they have something about merit scholarships. So they might ask you to write an essay about what the money means to you, or something else to add to the very lengthy admissions application to medical school. We don't do that anymore. We actually used to, but the admissions application is really, really long. You write your entire life history in there, basically. Everything that's medically related, some things that aren't. So our scholarship committee basically decided that we had all of this information. You're already writing 2 to 3 essays in the application materials that are addressing pretty much everything that we could think of to ask you anyway. And then you come for an interview, so you get to meet with people, talk about yourself. We can ask questions that we want asked of you and take notes about it. So we don't have a separate application anymore. We just use everything else that you send in to us. Need-based financial aid. So this is a snapshot of how many students in the current first year class qualified for need. So we had 72 students who ended up coming here this fall who applied for need-based financial aid. They checked all the boxes, did everything that was required of them. Of the 72, 49 of them qualified for need-based scholarship dollars. The average family contribution, which I'll talk about in a minute, for those 49 families was $37,000, which means that our average need-based scholarship for those 49 families was $22,000 and change. So not too bad. quarter tuition on average. So need-based financial aid here, pretty similar to other schools that require or have need-based scholarship dollars. So they use institutional methodology, which means that they just don't use a straight FAFSA formula. They have some other things that they put in there. So if a school requires parental information, when you go to fill out the FAFSA, it will tell you that, or tell your student when they're filling it out actually, that we no longer require parents' information because the government doesn't. They don't care once a student is of a certain age and going into certain degrees. So it will tell your student after they answer a series of questions that parental information is no longer required. But then something should pop up that says unless you're attending a U.S. medical institution that requires parental information. So the student would go on to complete parent information for schools that require it. Then most schools are going to ask for tax return information so that they can verify. Most medical schools do what's called 100% verification, which means that they're not going to just rely on the papers that you sent. With undergrad institutions, a lot of times it's kind of this selection process. The government kind of selects, or the school might select. Most med schools do 100%. So if a family is applying for need-based financial aid, they're going to ask for your tax returns. And they're going to ask for everything. They're going to ask for W-2s, federal tax return. If you own your own business, business tax returns. If you're a partner in a law firm, the law firm's business tax returns. So they ask for probably more than undergrad institutions are asking you for. And then all schools have some type of supplemental or institutional form. Most schools use CSS Profile, which is what most undergrad, or a lot, I guess, of undergrad universities use. So you can fill out the information, answer your 70 questions, whatever it is, and then that information goes to the schools and they look at the answers that they want. We don't use that because there can be a cost associated with it for students. Most students use something else, or most schools use something else until last year when that product went away, and there was a cost. So we just developed our own institutional form. It's very much like the CSS Profile. So if the student's sitting down and they're filling everything out, they just have to go to a few separate places, but it's all roughly the same questions that they're answering for the schools. What happens then is we get all that information, we pull it all together. The FAFSA generates an EFC, or expected family contribution. So how much based on family size, income, assets, taxes paid, age, all of the information you're putting on there. How much your family could potentially contribute to the upcoming year's educational costs. So we use that, and then we use a couple of other things that FAFSA doesn't. We look at things a little bit differently on some fields. Each school will. So as an example, for almost every med school that I can think of will ask if the parents own a home. And you'll say, yes or no. If you own a home, what's the purchase price? What's the home equity in it? What do you owe on it? What's your monthly payment, et cetera? You'll fill all that out. We ask for that information to get a full financial picture so that we can see how much money is coming in, how much money is going out. So where is that income going, the assets? So we can really kind of see if everything just makes sense. Some schools will ask that question and they will say, okay, well, you have $100,000 of home equity on your home. So you could take out a home equity loan. So that's $100,000 extra in assets. And they'll use that as an asset. So the way you answer those, you might be answering the same questions across the board, but the way the schools are using that information can be very different. Because it comes down to the school and how they are handing their money out, essentially, to students. Once they come up with that, all schools have basically a financial aid packaging formula. They can call it different things, but essentially it's a formula. Most of them are very similar. It's cost of attendance or budget for the year minus that EFC that they're going to come up with for you and your student. That determines how much need a student has, and then they package it. So our formula says that we take whatever the need is for a student and we split it in half. So if a student had a $40,000 need, they'd get $20,000 in scholarship, $20,000 in loans. Scholarship's free money. The loans can be a combination of federal and institutional loans. And then for us, we have a cap to the amount of need-based loans we'll award a student. So every year the cap changes. It's roughly 35% of the cost of attendance in a student's first year. So this year it's $29,000. Some schools in their packaging formula, a lot of schools will have what's called a base loan or a unit loan. So they'll say, okay, same $40,000 worth of need, but you have to borrow $30,000 before you can get any scholarship. So if you were comparing those two schools, you'd have $10,000 more scholarship dollars through us because we have a 50-50 split than the other school because you have to borrow $30,000 of your need first. You'd only get $10,000 of scholarship. So those little things can be different. Even if you're answering those same questions, when students get their financial aid awards back, they're going to have different EFCs that are generated. And again, it's because of what the schools are looking at and how they're using that information and the calculations and formulas they have on the back end for that. For our students, because our tuition is fixed and that's the largest component, if everything else stays kind of the same, they're going to have a similar financial aid need-based package from year to year. It's going to change because components in the cost of attendance do change. There's always changes to income or assets. You get a raise as a parent, you have a pay cut because of the economy, you lose assets or gain assets. So there's always changes that are going to affect a student's need-based financial aid. And again, that's true across the board. For us, the biggest thing that we see is if a student has a sibling in school. So that's another thing that medical schools, if they require parental information, they will look at siblings in school. But how they look at them is different. So for us, we say that we will count a sibling under the parent's umbrella if they are under the age of 30, typically unmarried, enrolled at least half-time in a degree-seeking program, where they would also be eligible for aid from their own institution, and they're not fully funded. So they're not one of our MSTP students, they're not a PhD student, the military is not funding their education. We would look at them whether they're undergrad, grad professional, et cetera, and we would include them in the household, just like we're expecting you or looking at you to pay or help with our student, and we would look at you to help pay for their education, just like we're looking at you for our student. So what can change then, some schools will say, well, we'll only look at a sibling if they're also enrolled in medical school. Or we'll only look at a sibling if they're in undergrad. Once they get to grad professional, we don't look at them. So those are things, again, you could fill out the same information, but they may or may not take the sibling. Siblings have a huge impact for most schools. We all, again, have different formulas. For us, if a family of 4 is applying for need-based aid, and it's mom, dad, and 2 children, and the student is a first-year med student, let's say, and their sibling's a senior in undergrad, we look at that as a family of 4 with 2 in school. So that family, when we get all the information back from all those forms, we could get a $90,000 family contribution on the parent side, which we wouldn't use because that $90,000 is the total. We would say, okay, there's 2 children for that to pay for, so we're going to cut it roughly in half. It's going to be about $45,000. In that example, if our cost of attendance is roughly 80 plus, that student's going to qualify for need-based scholarship dollars. If they go to apply for second-year aid and their sibling graduated, they're not sure what they're going to do yet, they're working, they're not under the parent's umbrella, they're not being claimed by you on their taxes, then the student's going to report a family of 3 to us with 1 in school. So there's 1 less person in that family household for the income and assets to support. So the $90,000 in this example that you never saw is probably higher. And the student at med school is it. So it can be the difference of qualifying for need or not from 1 year to the next. And that is definitely, outside of income asset changes, that is the biggest impact for our students if they have a sibling that comes or goes in school while they're enrolled over the 4 years. Some schools, it's not as big. The percentage might be 25% or 60, it might be larger because the schools are going to determine how they look at the siblings individually. If a student is, again, U.S. citizen, permanent resident, and they just don't think they're going to qualify, or they apply 1 year and don't qualify, and the family contribution is so large they decide to stop applying, students, or a school doesn't require parental information, it's just federal loans that the student is applying for, then the government has loans available to medical students with just their information. So no parent information required. The student can borrow currently up to $40,500 in a federal direct unsubsidized loan. Some schools it's a little higher. If their academic year is slightly larger than the typical 9.5, 10 months, then they can bump it up. I think it's like $42,000, so a couple extra $1,000. But most schools, it's going to be $40,500 annually. The rate changes every year. It's currently 6%. And then students can borrow an additional federal loan if they need to, because for most med schools, $40,500 won't cover everything. So Graduate Plus loan is another government loan. It has higher fees. You don't need parental information or a cosigner. You just have to have good credit. It is credit-based. Within the last 6 to 9 months, you just can't have anything really negative on there. A lot of our students don't really have any credit, so that's the biggest question we have. Well, if I don't have credit, what does that mean? As long as there's nothing negative, then not having credit shouldn't prevent you from getting the loan. And it has a higher rate, 7%, and students reapply for this every year. Some students, instead of taking out a federal loan, they might take out a private loan. They might work out something with their families. We have students doing all kinds of creative things, taking out family loans from grandma and grandpa, and they're a lot more flexible with repayment than the government is, or a private bank is. So sometimes there's things there. Some students, there was a while back, actually, there were a lot of families, a long while back, that were taking out home equity loans. So they would take out a home equity loan and use that to help pay. That is for you and your financial advisors to discuss. It just depends on rates and financing and all of that, yes.
With the federal loans, do they have the origination fees like the ones that
They
undergrad?
do, yep, exactly. Yep, so the fees, I believe, are the same across the board. They change every October 1. The interest rate, though, is higher for grad professional than for undergrad. And there is no more subsidized loans for grad professional students. So it's all going to accrue interest from the time the student borrows the money. It's all in their name. So that's the other difference. Parent Plus loans, undergrad parents will potentially take out a Parent Plus loan to help their student, and it's really for the student in your name. A Grad Plus is the student is getting that debt in their name, their loans, their repayment. And the terms are different. So with Parent Plus, you have to start paying. With the Grad Plus, it really works a lot like the unsubsidized. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
You said the interest starts accruing when they take the loan out?
From the time the loan gets applied to their student account. Yep.
So it's accruing while they're
Day one while they're in school. Yeah. It is simple interest. So unlike a credit card, you don't pay your balance. It's accruing. There's interest on interest on interest. The interest is just accruing on the amount that they have taken out that's hit their account until 6 months after they finish school. And then all that interest gets added to the principal and they have a larger balance. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, no. Outside programs. So there are a lot, or a few, outside programs that will either pay for the 4 years of medical school, the entire thing, tuition, stipend, doesn't matter which school, if you go where you're going and the government pays it if you qualify, if for the armed forces. Armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, typically it's 4 years of funding for the 4 years of medical school, and then your time and service is committed to them for 4 years after medical school. But it's not really after medical school, it's really after residency. So you have to look at, okay, well, what am I gonna do if I'm gonna do primary care? It's 7 years, basically, that I'm committed after medical school. But if I'm gonna go into surgery, that's a 7-year residency plus the 4 years of med school and the 4 years of military service. We've had students do all of these programs over the time I've been there. Top one, National Service Corps. If you are fully committed to doing primary care, you know in your heart, your student gonna do primary care. They're not gonna fall in love with surgery in the 3rd year and decide they wanna be a surgeon. They're not gonna specialize. Then National Service Corps is another program that will pay for the entire 4 years of medical school, give the student a stipend, pay for their books, and then the commitment is to practice primary care. Go to a primary care residency and finish, and then practice primary care, for 4 years out as well. So 4-year commitment's pretty standard. Primary care loan is a loan that schools get specifically for their students who are going into primary care. So this is the one where I mentioned earlier, a school may not have any institutional need-based scholarship funding, but they're still requiring parental information if they are graduating a lot of primary care students. And that's because they have access to primary care loan funding, which is interest-free for the student while the student's enrolled. It has a fixed 5% interest rate when the student finishes med school. It's deferred. There's no interest, no payment while the medical student finishes their 3-year primary care residency, and then they start repayment on it, and they have a 10-year repayment on whatever primary care loan they were awarded at a 5% interest rate. So it's a great loan, but you have to be committed to primary care, because if they get the loan and then decide they want to be a surgeon, interest goes back. The school has to put 7% interest back on the loan from the beginning, and there's like immediate repayment kind of repercussions for it. So it is a really great loan. Most schools do what's called a super PCL, so they wait until the student is either partially through their 3rd year or in their 4th year. And what happens is they use this loan, and it essentially buys back whatever other debt that they had, pays that off, so unsub loans, grad plus, institutional loans, and then it turns into a primary care loan, and they have that. Excuse me. And that is kind of a safety net that schools use so that the student doesn't get penalized if they decide something different, and it works within the program. They all also have loan repayment programs. So the armed forces, for most students, they don't know what they're going into. They are really just trying to figure out through the admission interview process where they're going to spend their 4 years of medical school, where they'll get accepted, and where they're going to go. So a lot of these, it's making another commitment, and they just aren't there yet. So armed forces, students can go into after residency. If they decide that's the path, they pay them their salary, they do their commitment, and they get loan repayment in addition to their salary. National Service Corps, Indian Health Services, they both have programs where you can work with underserved, underrepresented populations. Indian Health Services is practicing primary care on an Indian reservation. It's typically 2 years of service, and then depending on government funding each year, it's anywhere from about $40,000 to $80,000 worth of loan repayment in addition to your primary care physician salary to basically have you practicing in these areas. And that's another thing we've had a lot of students do, or several students do over the years, to help get their debt paid off. And then they can sign up for additional years. So they'll start off with 2. They still have debt. They like what they're doing and where they are, so they'll sign on for another 2 years. And then, hopefully for a lot of them, their debt is paid in full. In most recent years, we've had students do NIH loan repayment. So they are finished with med school and residency. They apply to the NIH under certain research umbrellas. They do research for 2 years either at the National Institute of Health in DC or at NIH-approved sites elsewhere in the country. And they get, typically, I think it's the first 2 years, it's $80,000 of loan repayment plus their salary. They're practicing, they're doing research, they're doing what they want to be doing, and they're getting this added benefit. We've had one student who actually just signed up. They kind of missed, they did the first 2 years, they missed the cycle to go immediately into another 2 years, so they're still doing research at the NIH. They applied and just got accepted for another 2. So at the end of 5 years, this student will have all of their debt paid off, and they had significant debt when they left. They were closer to $200,000, and they'll be, debt-free. Plus, they had their salary, and they were doing what they wanted to do during that time. So, averages, yes. This student, both. They're doing both. So they are not an MD PhD student. They were a straight MD student. They went through the MD curriculum, but WashU is a research institute. So we graduate a lot of students who are doing both. I mean, they're in the hospitals, but they are also spending 25% of their time in the lab doing research and have a project. Not necessarily through their whole career, but at different points in time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So clinical, usually it's clinical, and usually it's primary care related. There's a couple of different like umbrellas of research that they do. Mm-hmm. Any other questions about that? Okay. So this is our class of 2017. Our debt, if you look at all the U.S. News and World Report, Princeton Review, Dell AMC, it is low. It is great. It looks great in black and white. And as a financial aid director, this is what we want. But it is an average, and it doesn't mean that every student is graduating with less than $100,000 worth of debt. We have a lot of them, but it is not all of them. So we had 136 students graduate this past May. The year before we had 97 students because the trend of students, it caught up with us, the trend of students stepping out for a year to get another degree, a lot of them were getting that other degree, so we had 97 students graduate in 2016, and then they came back from that other degree, so we had a huge class this past May, 136. Of those 136, we had 76 students who graduated with medical school debt, and the medical school debt average for those 76 was $97,000. The national average for public, private together is right under 190. It's like 187 and change. This year it might be 189 and change. So we are significantly below that when we look at averages. But we have the whole range of debt, and we think that's much more important for you to know than just the average. So that's another thing when you're students looking at this and talking to schools, everyone just prints this number, but you really want to know what the span is and how many students are at what range of debt, because every school has people on the other ends of that spectrum. We had 6 students who graduated over $200,000 in debt in this class of 217, and 5 of those 6 were med school debt only. So the 6th one had undergrad or debt from another degree. But 5 of them, it was purely medical school debt from us here. And we had 1 student, the highest for the class of 2017 was just under $300,000. It was $298. So it will reach higher. If the cost of attendance is $80,000 plus every year for 4 years, or even if a student's just paying for tuition, maybe you're helping with living expenses, or they have enough scholarship that it's covering living expenses, but they're still paying $60,000+ in tuition over 4 years, they're going to be $250,000. So we do have them. So that's something when students come for interview days, we have a session with them very similar to this. It's much shorter though. It's like 20 minutes, so we pack it all in, 20 minutes, and we tell them kind of just the really important snippets, and we tell them that, compare all of these things, but ask these questions. Don't just ask what the average debt is. Look at what their ranges are, how many people they have throughout that, and we print that and give that to all of them so they have an idea. For our total educational debt average, we had 79 students, so a few more had debt maybe just from undergrad or just from another degree and or medical school. And the average debt was still under $100,000. It was like $99,365 or something. I forget the exact number, but still under $100,000. So how do they pay for that if they don't have one of the loan repayment programs? The government has a lot of loan repayment plans for those students with debt. So when I went to school and graduated a long time ago, the government had 3 plans: standard, graduated, and extended, the top 3. Yeah, so you could pay your debt off in 10 years, you could pay it off over 20, you could pay it off over 10 with the first couple of years giving you a smaller monthly payment and then increase it. That's graduated, but you still get it paid off in 10. Or if you had enough debt over $30,000, I think, if I remember back in the day, you could consolidate your loans and stretch it out to 30 years. That was it, only options. So the government has put these other loan repayment options in place to help, especially, and it applies to any students, whether your child goes to medical school or not, if they have loans from undergrad, what they would go into repayment in. But it really, really helps the medical community because, again, when they finish medical school, no matter where they go or what their debt is, their debt, for most of them, is going to be much higher than their starting resident salary. So this year, I think the starting resident salary was right at $50,000 for a PGY1, first-year resident. And even if our average debt is $100,000, their debt is twice what their starting salary is. And depending on how long they're in residency, so again, primary care residency, 3 years, maybe 4, their salary is going to hopefully at a minimum double when they're done with that, and they're making at the low end, $100,000, $120,000, $150,000. If they do a surgery residency, they're at that lower income for 7 to 8 years. Then their salary is going to really change more than others, but it's going to, triple, quadruple, whatever it might be, depending on what kind of surgery they're doing. But it really, these other repayment plans, they're all based on income. So for most first-year residents, a lot of medical schools do a lot of counseling for their graduating class. So it's pretty common for med school offices to do what we do. We sit down with every student for 45 minutes to an hour if they're graduating with debt, and we go over, this is all the debt that we know about. This is everything that you took out from the government, from the institution, et cetera. This is what we know about your undergrad debt. Do you have anything else? We put it all together. And then we look at, okay, where did you match? What city are you going to? What's your salary? The government's going to take taxes out of that, and you're going to have to pay health insurance, and you've got all these other things. So what's your take-home pay? How are you going to pay this $2,000 a month loan with, a take-home salary of $2,500 a month, living in Boston, or even living in St. Louis? So we sit down with them and go through that, and that's pretty common across the board for med school financial aid offices. Even those offices of one, sometimes they'll hire people to help them do this, but they will most likely sit down with their students one-on-one to make sure that they understand before they leave with that debt what they can do during residency to help them manage life and go on and do the other things that they want. They might want to start a family if they haven't already. They might want to buy a house. They might want to do these other things, finally buy a new car because they have had the same car forever and it doesn't run anymore. So we see all of those things, so we try to help them through it. And income contingent, income-based, pay-as-you-earn, and repay, those are all payments that take a percentage of the borrower's monthly gross income. That determines their monthly payment and goes towards their federal loans. So it does only apply to federal loans. And for a starting resident, the lowest salary that we or monthly payment that we see is about $350 if they're graduating, they're a family of one, and they're starting on a resident salary. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Does the public service loan forgiveness program also apply to med school federal?
It does. If it's around, it does. So the public service loan forgiveness, so we'll go through these for time's sake. So how many of you are familiar with public service loan forgiveness? Have heard of it, read it in the news? A couple, okay. It's been in the news. So we'll skip through these. Is that it? Yeah, public service loan forgiveness. Okay, so the government came up with this 2017, so this is the first year that any borrower will actually have any forgiveness recognized. And I think they're estimating that about 139 or so borrowers will actually see something. So this happened, I can't remember the exact when, 2010 maybe, and they went back and said, borrowers back with starting repayment back to 2007, if you make your payments to your federal loans from any, undergrad, grad professional school, federal loans, direct subsidized, unsubsidized, consolidated Perkins, graduate plus loans, then you make 120 payments under certain payment plans. So income contingent, income-based, not income contingent, yeah, income contingent, income-based, pay-as-you-earn, repay, or standard tenure, which if you did a standard 10-year repayment, you'd pay your loans off so you wouldn't have anything to be forgiven. So you do one of the income contingent plans. You made your monthly payments. At the end of 120 payments, any debt you had left would be forgiven. And you have to work for a 501c3 nonprofit. But what they're finding out is that because this program, so when it first started, there wasn't even an application, there wasn't even a process, and then they finally got an application together, and so they've made all of these kind of refinements to the program, which are good for the borrower, but the reason this year the cohort that potentially could have something forgiven is so small is because back in 2007 when students were graduating, it didn't exist. People didn't know about it. 2008, 2009, when we were counseling students, we're like, well, we really don't know a lot. I mean, we know this, and that's it, because it hadn't been, the government was still kind of working on it in a sense. So yes, if public service loan forgiveness is around, then medical students, very specifically, again, because they have this lower starting salary in the beginning and the highest debt that they'll have, could benefit significantly from public service loan forgiveness. That was not the intent, though, so there are lawmakers that say, well, the intent was to make it affordable for, people who have high debt and aren't going to be in high-paying jobs and getting those people into these public service loan jobs. So some people in Washington say, well, we want to put a cap on it. So even in the last 3 years, I think, of the Obama administration, they were presenting to Congress to put a cap on it, which is the maximum undergrad amount of loans. So that's still great, it's still a lot of money, but if you're expecting to get $200,000 forgiven at the end of 10 years and they're only gonna forgive $70,000, it's a huge difference. So that's why I say if it's around. So if your student is a freshman, you are 18 years away from seeing this because they have to get through 4 years of undergrad and accumulate their debt, 4 years of med school and accumulate their debt, then start paying for 10 years. So you're 18 years away. If they're a junior, you're a little closer, but you're still 12 years away. So we just don't know. I mean, new administration, new heads at the Department of Education, different philosophies on education, et cetera. So we don't really know where this will go. Also, there have been issues with paperwork. So as an example, when this program started, there wasn't really an application, there wasn't a lot of guidance necessarily on, there was gray area, I guess is the easiest way to say it. So people who thought that they were working under an approved 501c3 nonprofit organization are now submitting their paperwork, they thought everything was good, and it's coming back saying, oh, actually those 2 years of employment there didn't count. We actually had the same thing. So for our pediatric residents, they start their peds residency. Children's Hospital is a 501c3. They are paid through Children's Hospital. 3 years residency, great. They fill out the paperwork, those 3 years count. Well, then they decide to do a 2-year fellowship at Children's Hospital. For them, nothing's changed. They're getting a paycheck that looks the same. They're working at Children's Hospital, still a 501c3. But because of the bucket of money that they're actually paid from, it wasn't being counted. So, and that was something that came up because there was clarification from the IRS that said, oh, actually, yes, in this year, but no, you actually can't do that. So I think there's going to be a lot over the next, probably, I would say maybe 3 years, since this is the first year we'll see it, that we will learn as consumers and the government will learn and where they're going to go with this and what will happen to it. If it sticks around, it will be extremely beneficial for physicians, medical students, though. The programs I told you about. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes? No? Yes?
Yes, for MD, PhD
Mm-hmm.
students, do programs generally cover living expenses as well as books in addition to tuition, or is it just tuition?
Generally, they are fully funded programs, so they will pay the whole thing. They'll get their tuition paid, and then they'll get a stipend for paying for their living expenses, books, et cetera. It does depend on the funding that they have. So as an example, we have our MSTP or MD-PhD program has funding that we can use to pay for international students to also be MD-PhD students, and they can get their stipend, so everyone is the same in the program. Some schools, they might not have funding for international students, so they may or may not accept international students, or they might have a smaller fund for that, so they could only pay for tuition. But most of them, to my knowledge, will pay for everything if they accept the MSTPs, if they have the program and accept them in.
Are the stipends, the living expenses pegged to the cost of living of the area?
Yeah, actually, our MSTP students get more money, receive more money in their stipend than our students on financial aid can get through aid. So their stipend, I believe this year was either $27,000 or $29,000. St. Louis is cheap if they're a family of one. I mean, a lot of our MSTP students are going to be here for a long period of time compared to an MD student. So a lot of them will buy a condo, buy a home. I mean, they'll settle here for a while, and they have the funding to do that.
What's the average length of time?
For our MSTP students, I think we're at 7.5 years. So between 7 and 9. We don't have most of them are out by 8, but. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about this program, the MD-PhD program? Who gets in, what do they do afterwards? Just a little bit more.
So the MD-PhD, they are students who they do the 4-year MD program, and then they get their PhD in research. And highly competitive. There has to be when they apply to the program, they have another section of the MCAT application that talks all about their research. experiences and what they've done. And then if they fit, they have extensive interviews that they come for. And if they are the right fit and they have the right research background and all of these other components as well, then they also have to be able to match that student's research with, they have to have a PI, a principal investigator in the lab that can, basically continue on or have a match there, someone to take them under their wing. But that's what it is. They're getting both. They're going through, instead of going and getting a PhD and then getting an MD degree, it's a joint program. So for us, our students do the first 2 years. They everyone enters at the same time. They do 2 years in the MD degree. Then they step out. They go into the lab for their 6, 7, 8 years, and then they come back and finish year 3 and 4 and go on to residency. For our students, almost all of them go on to residency. And then after that, they go all over. They work for biotech firms. They work in a lab. They're practicing, clinical physicians, and they have a lab and patients. So, yeah, so it varies. Yes.
If you could give me a sense of timing of things, when do they start hearing from medical schools? At what point do they start applying for financial aid? When do they hear what they qualify for financial aid?
Perfect, yeah. So right now we are in the application process. So interviews just started for next fall's class. Interviews across the country typically start sometime in October. Every school's a little different. So students go through that. Admissions announcements are different across the board. So some schools will say, we send out one thing, we meet throughout the cycle, and then in the end of February, we send out like a mass mailing of all the accepted students. We have what's called rolling admission. So the admissions committee starts meeting throughout our process between October and March. And then at a point in the process, they start admitting students. And then all the students who've been interviewed up to that point get reevaluated, and they keep getting looked at in the larger pool, and they're accepting students throughout. Almost all medical students have a financial aid deadline of April 1. Some are a little earlier, but most of them are April 1. Students can start applying for aid. The FAFSA is available now due to changes last year. So October 1 it was opened, but most schools don't have their cost of attendance. They don't have their tuition fixed, things like that. So they usually say April 1 is the deadline, because then they have their cost of attendance. And students, the AAMC allows them to hold multiple acceptances to medical schools until May 1st. On May 1st, they can only hold one acceptance. So having an April 1 deadline for financial aid offices to get those financial aid offers to students gives a month of kind of wiggle room to, the student can make comparisons, call their financial aid offices, get counseled through it, et cetera, and then make their decision if numbers play a role. If schools have merit scholarships, again, it kind of depends. For schools that have that like mass acceptance, a lot of times they'll then have a mass, merit acceptance as well, and they'll say, okay, now we've awarded our merit. We have rolling admission, so the same thing happens with merit. We have multiple times throughout the cycle where students are being evaluated for our merit scholarships and then notified. Good, yeah, yes?
Is there a relatively stable proportion of WashU undergrads who get accepted and then go to WashU Medical School, or does that vary greatly from year to year?
That's a great question. I did not bring those statistics with me, so I don't feel comfortable answering. But I know we interview a lot of WashU pre-meds, a lot of students. I think it varies from year to year, just depending on the population and the students that come through. But I mean,
there's no special consideration if you succeeded undergraduate at WashU.
So there is one program where there's, real special consideration that students apply for, and they interview actually when they're interviewing here. And then if they get accepted into that and then meet certain GPA requirements, et cetera, then they get special consideration to be accepted. But other than that, I think, I wouldn't say yes or no. I think it really, yeah. I would rather get all the statistics before I answer that one. Yes.
And did you provide your contact information?
Oh, I think at the very beginning. It's, let me go back. There's probably a faster way to do this, sorry. I am not technological at all. Any other questions out there? Yes? Yeah, it is increasingly more common for students to take a gap year. Yes, exactly. I wouldn't say everyone takes one, but So I have been at the medical school for this is my 18th year, and I think I am actually a member of the admissions committee, and I've been on the admissions committee interviewing students for maybe half that time, maybe a little less. And when I started, a gap year was like uncommon. I mean, the question was, well, why did you take a gap year? I mean, explain this to me, because it wasn't the norm, but it is increasingly more common. I mean, if I see it now, 1 or 2 years, I don't really even think twice. I just, oh, what'd you do? Why, and they're doing all kinds of things when they do take those gap years. So they want to have more research experience, or they just wanted time off and they're doing other things, or they wanted more clinical experience, so they're volunteering because maybe they didn't get to do that as much as they wanted to. So what they do in those gap years, it varies across the board. Yeah, I wouldn't say there's one thing that's the most common either. Yes.
Could you touch on housing, like where the students typically stay when they're in medical school?
Yeah, for us, we actually do have student housing. It's not like here, it's an old 1950s dorm, so might be it's what I remember as student housing before it was called student housing. It was just a dorm. We have one, although we are renovating some new buildings to be student housing on campus. Most schools, I would say, don't have student housing for medical school. I would say that that's kind of rare, and they just live, general population. I mean, they're living, like for our medical students, some of them will come over here and live across the park, but most of them are living in the Central West End within walking distance to the hospital. And that's because of, third year, when they're in the hospital, depending on what rotation they're in, if they have to be there at 2 o'clock in the morning or they're going home, for a short break, they want to be really close. And I would say that's pretty common for most medical schools. The students are living in just the neighborhoods and communities as close as possible to the campus.
I was thinking about the additional cost
Uh-huh.
on top of the,
Oh, yeah.
so that's what I was trying to figure out. My other question is, do you see the students applying for med school? Is it the junior year? I didn't catch undergrad.
So typically in their senior year, and there is a cutoff. So I don't know exactly what that cutoff is, where sometimes if they didn't start the process, it will force them into a gap year because they've missed kind of the deadlines. So they usually start, because they have to take the MCAT. So some students will take the MCAT in their junior year, so that then that's done, and then they can just work on the application process in like that spring of senior year. But we also see students taking the MCAT in their senior year, or sometimes they'll take it twice, once just to see, get a feel. It's kind of like ACTs, SATs on a different scale, but they just want to see what it's like, et cetera, and then take it later. Mm-hmm.
With the gap year, can you qualify to go to medical school and then take a gap year, or do you have to?
So we do have students that will defer. Okay. They'll go through the process, they'll get accepted, and then they will decide, it isn't automatic that if that happens and they decide to do it, it's a special request to the admissions dean, pretty common across the board. And then the dean of admissions will decide if they will allow them to do that or not based on the reasoning of why they're taking a gap year. So I would say in that instance, the most common reason for a student to go through the process, get accepted, and then decide that they want to step back and take a year is because they're doing research and maybe they're already in a project and it's not finished. That's not always the case, but I would say that is the most common reason for that to happen.
What about financial? Say the student wants to, work for a year to get a head start on.
Sure. Sometimes, yes, I've seen that as well.
But it is possible.
Yes, it is possible. Yeah, and that would be school by school, so it would definitely be a question that the student would want to ask the school. What do you, in what?
No, I mean, are there structured kinds of approaches to a gap year?
So again, they really do all kinds of things. I mean, it's structured in some ways, yes, if the student is going to continue to do research, maybe they were in a lab. I would say as far as structure, that's probably the most common one. Or they applied for a job and it was a 2-year commitment or a 1-year commitment. So we've seen that too. There's a lot of health startup companies. So we see students going to work for those companies and doing things, or biotech industry, and they might think, okay, yeah, I'm going to take this job, but it's really a 2-year commitment. So sometimes that will push it. So those are the more structured things. The unstructured are, they're going to go home, they want to save money, and they just kind of need a break, and they're going to maybe get a job, maybe do some extra volunteering, things like that. Does that help? Anything else? I don't know what you guys have the rest of the day. This is the earliest I've ever done the talk, so usually I'm it, so I just hang out for a long time. Anything else? No? I did not mention a whole lot about international students. For international applicants, for most schools, it will be if they accept international students or not, and then if they do, what aid is available to them. Most schools do not offer aid for international students. The international students have to come up with the funding. And then the school policy changes from school to school. The government policy is a student in the US has to provide 1 year of funding up front. That's what the undergrad campus requires. We require 4 years of funding. So if an international student is coming to Washington University School of Medicine, they have to come up with about $300,000 plus before they ever get here, because they have to have that money in an account to pay for the 4 years, because there isn't funding if they get into a financial bind that we can get for them from the government or other resources. Some schools will have a 2-year funding. St. Louis University is exactly like ours pretty much. Some of the top private med schools will do 2 years of funding. It just really depends. And they change those policies sometimes as well. Any other questions? Thank you guys. Enjoy the beautiful weather. Good luck to your students.